And welcome, welcome, welcome. This is Peter Winnick. I'm the founder and CEO of Thought Leadership Leverage. And you're joining us on the podcast today, which is Leveraging Thought Leadership. Today, my guest is Mike O'Toole. He is the president of PGA. He is a blogger for Forbes CMO Network. He's a speaker at Columbia University's Bright Conference. He's spoken at South by Southwest, undergrad from Notre Dame, and business school at Yale. So a pretty active person on the marketing side here. So welcome aboard, Mike.
Thanks, Peter. It's good to be here.
Great. So let's just sort of dive right in. So English to business to thought leader, author, president of an agency. So how did all that happen?
Well, God, if I look back when I was 19, 20, I would not have predicted this path. But there's always through lines, and I think the through line for me is communications and persuasion. It was what interested me about the text I was reading as an English major. My first job out of college was doing development for a nonprofit, which is about trying to get donors to part with their money. And so, in that sense, joining a advertising agency where it's all about persuasion and getting people to try to pay attention to brands in a crowded world. There's a through line there. And business school was, I was coming from the nonprofit world and realized, I want to have a family and all that kind of stuff. Maybe I need some additional business skills.
Got
And
it.
so,
So you lost your taste for ramen noodles early on, right?
yeah, exactly. Plenty of those mac and cheese, ramen.
Exactly, exactly. So let me ask you this: if we stay with that through line, because a couple of thoughts here on sort of that attention and persuasion and all those things, which obviously make sense moving from sort of the development side of nonprofit clearly to the agency side. How does one do that as an author, thought leader, or speaker? I mean, talk about crowded markets. How do I persuade and get attention without lighting my hair on fire as an author, thought leader, or speaker?
I was hoping you could tell me, Peter. That's sort of your expertise. It's super hard, right? I think it's. I forget who says it off the top of my head, but an abundance of information creates a poverty of attention,
Yes.
and I feel like we've got such an impoverished attention span collectively out there. So the good news is I run a business to business advertising agency, so it's not like I'm trying to reach everybody in the world. So I'm trying to focus on marketing decision makers who are in the business to business industry, companies like technology companies, life sciences companies, financial services. So that at least is a focus market to try to build attention.
Well, but I want to pause you there for a minute, Mike, because I think I mean you went by that very quickly, but I think it's a critical issue is that we can't get everybody's attention and we can't persuade everyone. So the more laser focused you can be is at least a starting point because it's an impossible task. And one of the worst things I hear when I'm potentially working with a client early on is, oh my stuff would be great for everybody. And I said, okay, well, first we have to figure out the 97 or 99% of the world who it's not great for, or it's less than
Yeah.
ideal for, because as you said, the attention and the time. So I love that you've got the specificity of your market. Anything else to add in terms of how to get the signal and the noise problem today?
Well, in fact, I just wanted to push that further because I think it's a really important thing. So, like, I've got formally, I'm not talking to 350 million consumers. I'm talking to, I don't know, call it 50,000 marketing decision makers. So that helps really,
Yeah.
winnow it. But I'm not even talking to all 50,000 of them, right? And this is a kind of a core point that we talk a lot about as an agency, and I talk about in my book, which is that you're really not trying to reach 100% of your target. You're trying to reach the, call it 20 to 30% who really are on the same wavelength as you, who sort of understand how you think, care about what you care about, want what you're good
Yep.
at. We call those crazies. And so, the whole point behind my thought leadership is not to say, hey, for any garden variety marketer out there, this is a way for you to think about the world. It's more for marketers who are thinking about doing something a little differently or disrupting the status quo. That's who I want to be talking to.
Wait, but let's push on that even further, Mike, because I'll see that and raise you one. I feel like we're like in poker game here. I think that
We're going to be down to like 10 people by the time we're
no, well, okay, but that's the other side of the continuum. But that like-minded piece, that the outlier, the crazy, the however you define it, and it doesn't have to be an outlier crazy. It could be a person who always does risk averse, could be another type. But the trick is you can't afford to educate, convert, and then sell somebody onto something. So the trick is find out those that are already educated and converted to have a similar ilk, similar mindset, similar perspective that you do relative to what you're trying to sell. And there are things that you can do to make some educated guesses around that. What's a predictive indicator that someone that thinks this way or belongs to this sort of group, or if they're into conscious capitalism, they're probably into B Corps, or there's some logic that goes there. Would you agree? Would you disagree?
I think it's a great point, and I like that. So there's ways to target based on behaviors or shared interests, and that's part of what we do. And then the other way that the other way is, I don't know if this sounds counterintuitive, but it's almost like let people self-identify with what you're
Yes.
saying. So you can target people who are already there, but then you can also cast a wide net to find people who might not have already raised their hand and say, hey, I'm a disruptor, I'm a change agent, I'm a conscious capitalist, but I am kind of intrigued in those topics. And that to me has been important because like when I've done my podcast, and so, by the way, it's fun to be on this side of the microphone as opposed to yours for a change. But it's been, it's very much story based
Sure.
podcasting. And so I think it's important to let the story unfold as it is, and sometimes it takes you in surprising ways, but sometimes those surprising ways can help you make connections with people you wouldn't think are naturally on the same page as you. So that's been kind of fun
Right. So
too.
if we look at your podcast, for example, shockingly, it's called Unconventionals. That sounds like if I were in a meeting somewhere whiteboarding out, what are PJA, what's an avatar for a PJA client? I might call them unconventionals, right? Based on the attributes, etc.
Exactly.
So holy cow, let's have a podcast called Unconventionals. Said the guy whose podcast is basically, the reverse name of his company, right? So there's a reason that you do that, right? Like my expectation is not that Tim Ferriss is going to have to find another line of work because you and I are on this podcast today, right? It's targeted, it's focused. We care about our markets and we go deep on what they've got. So the fact that you're branding your podcast in a way that very much lines up to the type that you're looking to talk to, that's very much aligned with what we're saying here.
Yeah, I think so.
Cool. So let's switch a little bit and talk about maybe some tactical ways or some creative ways. How else are you? Because ultimately, you're making your money as an agency, right? The money that you make from Forbes or books or whatever. That's we'll call that nominal.
Yes.
Probably being generous and calling it that, right? But your bread and butter is agency, competitive space, crowded space, etc. How are you thoughtfully and strategically in using your thought leadership to differentiate and ultimately find net new clients for the agency?
Well, it's a great question. And I would say I don't have all the answers there because it's hard sometimes. There's not always a direct one to one connection. Like sometimes people will say, hey, so how many accounts have you gotten because you ran the Unconventionals podcast? And it's not always
Yeah.
easy to answer that. But I would say there is an absolute relationship between building visibility for the agency through something like the Unconventionals,
Mhm.
which is not at all, we're not talking about our capabilities. We're not talking about how we're such a great agency. We're
Sure.
not talking about how our creative is better than their creative. We're talking about ideas that might be important to
Yep.
marketing thinkers. And that's a way of, you know, increasing visibility and engaging people who then down the road say, unconventional is interesting. The guy who runs an agency. Let that ferment in the back of my mind. When I'm on the hunt for an agency, that's maybe somebody I'll put on the list. So I think it works that way. The other way it works, and this was a surprise to me, is that the unconventionals and the stories, when I was out interviewing people like, from Waze to Warby Parker to Converse, those conversations taught me something about brand strategy and really informed and helped shape and evolve our approach to brand strategy for our
Okay.
clients. So that was really, it wasn't just about promotion, it was also about learning, and then bringing that learning back into our core
So it's
practices.
sort of there's multiple pieces. There's an R&D piece, right? Because you're having an opportunity to have all these great conversations with people doing really cool things. By accident, you're going to learn something from that you might take back into the agency. I would also say that it probably shows that you're a bit, sort of cutting edge, right? So if I was in the market to shop, 5 agencies and RFP it or something like that, and you had the podcast, I might not give you the business because of that, but it's another door for me to come in and say, let me see what this guy's about. Let me listen, go listen to a couple episodes, and I can either go, that's interesting, I dig that, I like it, in a non statement of work, RFP, proposal, pitching sort of environment.
Yeah, that's true because I think whether it's in their RFP or it's something that's subtle or
Yeah.
indirect or even unconscious, I think people want to say, am I choosing someone who is current, is connected to the zeitgeist, understands how communications are happening today? What are the most effective channels today? And podcasting is just one of them, right? I mean, we both have podcasts and we know that. What's just this is a little bit of an aside. If I have a second though,
Yeah.
Peter, is what's interesting is the first audio I did was something about 10 years ago. It was called This Week in Social Media, and it was a weekly internet radio show. And there was an internet radio station, can't even remember the name of it, that was out of Portland, Oregon, and they had sort of 20,000
Oh wow.
listeners. So I did that live through that internet radio station, and we called it PJ Radio then because the sense was radio is better than podcasting, and podcasting was happening back then, but it was very kind of cottage industry stuff, like two guys talking in their garage, and the sound quality was shitty, and so podcasting, it wasn't until the past like 3 or 4 years ago that podcasting became the juggernaut that it is and took on that sheen, and then we proudly called ourselves a podcast, even though we always were a podcast. So it's funny how that stuff shifts.
Well, words and labels matter, right? So, when you first start to listen to podcasts, you're like, isn't this really what radio used to be from what I could, when I look up the history of that in the 30s,
Yeah,
right? And
exactly.
there's just different flavors of it and the storytelling ones or that. Cool. So let's move a little bit to other things that you're doing because you're very active, right? You're speaking, you've got forums, you've got your podcast. Maybe talk about something that you used to do with your content and thought leadership that you gave up on because it either bored you or you weren't seeing an outcome that warranted it continuing to do it.
Yeah, and I'm not sure this is well, I'll just answer it. So I used to be very active on Twitter. And there was this virtuous circle where I would write a post on Forbes, I tweet about it, and I would get, based on that, my Twitter following, I would get like a bunch of hits to the articles.
Okay.
And I stopped seeing that. That stopped happening because there was a sense of Twitter is like, for a while there at least, it was like you get a ton of followers, but you didn't know if they were bots
Right,
or you
right,
didn't know
right.
if people were actually paying attention. So I just stopped probably a couple years ago. I mean, I'm still on Twitter. I occasionally post, but I spend much less time trying to actively build a Twitter following as a way to distribute my thought leadership. I'm sure other people find very different, and there's great thought leaders out
Sure.
there that have these enormous followings, and they continue to it bears fruit for them. But that was just something I stopped doing because it just felt like there was a lot of care and feeding of a Twitter
Yeah,
feed.
yeah,
It's the
yeah.
daily lots of activity, as you know, and that was it. Just at a certain point, kind of lost my attention or didn't seem as
So
valuable.
I think that's fairly common, yet it's interesting because there's so many places where people spend time and energy, and the trick is to figure out where are your people spending the right time and energy. Do I have to be there? Like, is Instagram really a place for you? So, for example, we do quite well in terms of our marketing efforts for us. LinkedIn's a home run for us, and Twitter's actually still quite good for us. Not as much as it used to be in terms of direct inquiries, but it's more of a brand validation piece.
Yeah, yeah.
We're doing a lot more on Instagram the last year or two, and every time sort of I look at some of the numbers and all that, I'm not convinced that we're getting the returns there. So ultimately, in the next couple of months, I'll probably just downshift. We won't not going to turn it off and deactivate an account, but you say, okay, let's spend less of our marketing energy there, put it sort of on cruise control, and see where else. SlideShare for a while was fun.
Instagram is such a visual medium that and you're a marketer of ideas and people. It's not quite inherently as
Right.
visual, and maybe I feel the same way about that. Although LinkedIn, by the way, is really important for us. We use the agency Twitter feed to promote some of the thought leadership. It was a way we promoted, and we started to move from just trying to hope we'd get organic pickup to doing some paid promotion on Twitter for the Unconventionals podcast, and those that did work. And it's sort of like I would say there's a bigger point there from relying on organic pickup from our Facebook page, Twitter feed, LinkedIn, and having to make sure we were goosing that organic sharing through some paid placements. And it wasn't a ton of money, but it felt like that was a requirement just to stand out in those
No,
networks.
I mean, I think that's a good point, and the rules of engagement for each one are a little bit different. But I think you're right. It doesn't have to be a $1,000 a month spend or something like that. But sometimes just that drip of a $20 promotion here and there at Facebook or something like that does seem to keep you in the game a little bit longer, which is probably not an accident.
Yeah,
In terms of that.
exactly.
Cool. So let's get a couple minutes left here. If you were to be talking today from where you stand to say T minus 15 years, starting out in the game of using content and thought leadership, in this case to market a professional services firm, what would you tell someone?
Wow, there's a lot of places I might go. I think one thing I would say is find out what interests you personally, like what you have real passion about, because you can you can overdo the like, hey, my audience wants to hear about analytics, and all my stuff's gonna be about AI and analytics. Well, maybe that's not that interesting to me, and maybe I actually don't feel like I'm that expert on it. So, find the thing that you can actually muster up the passion and energy for to do on an ongoing basis, because this stuff is a lot of work, as you know
Yep.
better than I do.
But that has to intersect. So if I'm fascinated with collecting turtle shells or something, that wouldn't work. So it's where's that intersection of what you're passionate, interested about, and what your audience cares about.
Yeah, well said. I think that's exactly right. Like, there's a couple things that I think are these are maybe smaller points, but that just been interesting along the way. Like, if you're a marketer, you're listening out there and you're a marketer, don't try to talk at marketing conferences because there's a million people who already like you. Yeah, it's more interesting in a way to try to talk at
Yep.
industry conferences. Go to the vertical markets that you want to talk to. Say it's financial services and industrial. Go to those conferences because your expertise will be more rare and valuable.
That's an amazing point because several years ago, I had a client that was a leadership guy that came out of the agile software movement. And we went to a couple of events where we were speaking together. And I said, wait a minute, there are no buyers here. Like, why are you here? And the culture back then was all these agilists, which it was almost like a debate. It wasn't in the format of a debate, but I'm going to present my thing and I'm smarter than Mike. And then Mike's going to come back next year and show he's smarter than me. And it's just a lot of noise. And I'm like, okay, well, what is your objective for going to this conference? Is it sort of that intellectual, puffery? Or you here for what you said you were, which is to find net new clients because there isn't any in the room. So I think that's understanding the culture of the event. But also like there being the only marketer in a non-marketing conference. But by default, you're going to stand.
Yeah, because otherwise you're jostling with other people who they're just smart people talking about
Yeah.
similar stuff. Um, Another thing that these are sort of like advice A and advice B. I think that you should first focus on your own platform. Like, what is your idea, as opposed to like, what's the next blog post or next speech I'm going to give? So, what feels like it's your platform? And the unconventionals for me is a platform that
Yep.
allows me. I did the podcast for 6 years. It was the foundation for the book that I just released. It drives tons of blog posts. It informs how I pitch clients. So what's your
Yep.
bigger
Couldn't agree
platform
more.
that can be, it's a block, that you can franchise, like Disney's
Yep.
so great at franchising movies. They don't have to come up with a bunch of original ones.
Well, it
So
also serves as it's a bit counterintuitive, but by having it as almost a limiting constraint actually helps your creativity. Because one of the litmus tests would be, wait a minute, would a listener of the podcast of the conventionals care about this? And if the answer is no, then move on to the next thing.
yeah, that's a really great point. It's actually, we were talking about LinkedIn earlier. What I really like their thinking about the change, the evolving nature of content marketing. It's moving from the newsroom model where you produce just a ton of content every day to the Hollywood
Yep.
model, which is about creating a franchise and a blockbuster that you can repeat over
Yeah.
and over again. And I really like that kind of simple rule of a simple way to understand how to focus and extend your thought leadership, as opposed to feel like you're impossibly trying to fill up a new bucket of thought leadership every day or every week.
Right. No, good point. Well, this has been great. I appreciate you being on the other side of the mic today. Right. It's always
Yeah.
easier on this side, right? I just have to ask questions. But yes,
Right.
we'll switch chairs next time. But I appreciate you sharing your
Yeah,
story, and I appreciate all that you shared with us. I think there's a lot that folks can learn from that. So thank you so much for joining us, Mike.
Peter, it's been fun.
To learn more about Thought Leadership Leverage, please visit our website at thoughtleadershipleverage.com. To reach me directly, feel free to email me at peter@thoughtleadershipleverage.com. And please subscribe to Leveraging Thought Leadership on iTunes or your favorite podcast app to get your weekly episode automatically.